In the autumn of 1883, Stone County, Missouri was still the kind of place where a man could go into the woods and not come out, and no one would be particularly surprised. The Ozark Highlands of southern Missouri were, in 1883, among the least settled terrain in the state. The land was rugged and heavily forested, the kind of forest that had been old when the first European trappers moved through it in the 18th century, and that had not become less old in the decades since. The timber was dense and varied, mixed hardwood and pine, cut through by creeks and hollows that ran in directions that did not correspond reliably to what the available maps suggested. Men who knew the Ozarks moved through them by accumulated knowledge and instinct. Men who didn't know the Ozarks moved through them carefully, or not at all. The trappers of Stone County knew the Ozarks. This is the first thing to understand about what happened in Whitmore Forest in November of 1883. These were not casual outdoorsmen. They were not men who had underestimated the terrain or overestimated their abilities. They were, by any measure applicable to that era and that occupation, the best at what they did. They had been working these woods for most of their adult lives. Several of them had been working these specific woods, the timber stands and creek bottoms and ridge trails of the area that was locally called Whitmore Forest. After a family that had homesteaded at its southern edge in the 1840s for 20 years or more, they went in as a group, not because any one of them was uncertain of his ability to manage the terrain alone, but because what had been reported near the river camps was not something that any one of them wanted to investigate alone. The reports had started in September. A trapper named Cale Dubois, working a line on the eastern edge of Whitmore Forest along the White River, had found tracks. He described them in a letter to his brother in Springfield, a letter that has since been located in a private family collection and that has been examined by several researchers. As follows: I cannot say what animal made these tracks, because I have never seen any animal make tracks of this size and shape. The size alone would suggest a bear, a large one, but the shape is not right for bear, and the stride is not right for bear, and the depth of the impression in the mud suggests a weight that even a large bear does not carry. I measured the track against my hand, and my hand fit inside it 3 times. I have been trapping these woods for 19 years. I have never seen anything that made this track. Dubois showed the tracks to 2 other trappers working nearby lines. They agreed with his assessment. The track was not from any animal they recognized. One of them, a man named Harlon Vess, who had trapped from the Ozarks to the Rockies over a 30-year career, said that in 30 years of trapping, he had seen sign of every large animal native to the country, and that this track was not from any of them. He said this with the particular steadiness of a man who is choosing his words to be accurate rather than dramatic. And the people who heard him said that the steadiness was, in itself, the most unsettling part. Through October, more tracks appeared. They moved. Not in the random way of an animal working a territory, but in a directional way, moving over successive sightings from the eastern edge of Whitmore Forest toward its interior. The tracks were accompanied, on 2 occasions, by other sign that the trappers who found it declined to describe in detail. One of them, a man named Amos Clay, who had lived his whole life in Stone County and who was known as a man of precise and literal speech, said only that the sign he found alongside the tracks on the second occasion was not sign he was familiar with, and that he had no language for it that he was comfortable using. The decision to go in as a group was made at a meeting held at the Whitmore General Store in late October. 27 men attended. The meeting was organized by a trapper named Samuel Reach, who was 44 years old and who was, by the informal consensus of the trapping community in Stone County, the most capable man in the group. He had been trapping Whitmore Forest for 22 years. He knew it in the way that people know places they have lived with their whole working lives. Not just the trails and the water sources and the good lines, but the quality of the light at different seasons, the sound the timber made in different winds, the particular character of the terrain that communicated, to someone paying attention, what was normal and what was not. He had seen the tracks. He had spent 3 days following them, as far as he could follow them, before they disappeared into the interior of the forest, in a manner that he described to the meeting as, and this is the word he used, according to 2 people who were present and who recorded it later, abrupt. He said the tracks had not faded or become harder to read as they moved into denser terrain. They had simply stopped, mid-stride, as if whatever had been making them had lifted off the ground or ceased to exist. He said, "I don't know what's in that forest. I have been in that forest for 22 years, and I don't know what's in it now that wasn't in it before." He said, "I think we need to go in and find out." 26 men agreed. 27, including Reach, committed to the expedition. They assembled at the southern edge of Whitmore Forest on the morning of November 3rd, 1883. They were equipped, collectively, with 27 rifles, 11 lanterns, a substantial amount of ammunition, 3 weeks of provisions, rope, tools, and everything else that a large group of experienced woodsmen would think to bring into an extended forest expedition. They had among them men who could read sign, men who could navigate by stars and terrain, men who could survive for extended periods in difficult conditions. They were, as groups of men go, as well prepared as preparation could make them. They entered the forest at first light. They were seen going in by a boy named Thomas Whitmore, a grandson of the family for whom the forest was named, who was watching from the fence of the family's south field. He watched all 27 men enter the tree line and disappear into the timber. He later told investigators that they had moved in good order, in a loose formation, with Reach and 2 other men at the front. He said they had not seemed afraid. He said they had looked to his 12-year-old eyes like men who knew what they were doing. He was the last person to see all 27 of them. 11 days later, on the morning of November 14th, Thomas Whitmore's father looked out the same south field window at dawn and saw 9 men standing at the tree line. They were standing in a perfect line, evenly spaced, facing east. They were not moving. He watched them for what he estimated as several minutes, certain he was seeing something wrong before he went out to them. What he found when he reached them, what he saw in their faces, what he heard or did not hear from them, he described in a written statement given to the county sheriff 2 days later. The statement is preserved in the Stone County Court records. It reads, in its relevant portion, as follows. He wrote, "I went out to them at dawn and found 9 men standing in the field line in the manner described. I recognized some of them. I called their names. None of them answered. They were standing with their eyes open, looking east, and they did not turn when I called or when I touched the shoulder of the man nearest me. The man I touched, I believe it was Harlon Vess, though I cannot be entirely certain in the light, did not respond to my touch, but I felt him breathing. They were all breathing. They were alive. But they were not present in any way that I can explain better than this. They looked like men whose attention was somewhere else entirely, somewhere so far from the field they were standing in that my voice and my touch did not reach it. He wrote, "I went back to the house and sent my son for the sheriff. The 9 men stood in the field line for another hour until the sheriff arrived, and none of them moved during that hour. When the sheriff arrived, they were still standing. He spoke to them and got no response. He had 2 deputies with him, and they assisted the men into the house and sat them in chairs and gave them water, which they drank when it was brought to their lips, but which they did not reach for themselves." He wrote, "They sat in my house for 6 days. During that time, they ate when food was brought to them, and drank when water was brought to them, and they slept at night in the manner of men who sleep very deeply, and without apparent dreaming. None of them spoke for 6 days. On the 7th day, the morning of November 20th, Harlon Vess, I am certain it was Vess by then, looked at me across the breakfast table and said, 'It was not an animal.' Those were the first words spoken by any of them, and they were spoken with the particular tone of a man completing a conversation that had been interrupted, as though he had been thinking the words for 6 days and had only now found the way out of his head for them." He wrote, "After that, they all spoke, and what they said, all 9 of them, separately and together, in the same words in the same order. I will not write in this statement, because I do not believe a written statement is the correct place for it. I have told the sheriff, and I will tell him again if he asks, but I will not write it down. The statement ends there. The sheriff did ask. He spoke to all 9 men separately and together over the course of 3 days, and he recorded what they told him in his own notes. His notes were sealed by the county court within a week of their completion, under a designation that the county court records describe only as sensitive material, community welfare. They remained sealed for 41 years. When they were finally opened in 1924, the county archivist, who broke the seal, read the notes and immediately resealed them under a new designation. They were opened again, partially, in 1967. The portions released at that time are the basis for what follows. To understand what the 9 men described, it helps to understand Whitmore Forest itself, what it was in 1883, what it had been before that, and what the people who had lived nearest to it for the longest time understood about it that the trappers may not have fully credited before November of 1883. The forest covered, in 1883, approximately 40 square miles of the Stone County Highlands. It was not a contiguous named wilderness in any official sense. The name was local usage, derived from the Whitmore family, whose farm sat at its southern edge, and it was used to refer to a region of particularly dense and old-growth timber that occupied a significant portion of the county's interior. The trees at its center were old enough that the oldest residents of Stone County, when asked about them, could not say how old they were. Old-growth Ozark timber was not unusual in 1883. Much of the region had not yet been logged, but the timber at Whitmore Forest's heart was old in a way that even experienced loggers who had seen old-growth timber across the region noted as exceptional. The trunks were wide. The canopy was dense enough to create a permanent quality of interior shadow, even in full summer, that made the deep forest feel like a different climatic zone from the surrounding land. The forest had a center, not a geographic center, a qualitative one. A place that trappers who worked the outer ranges of Whitmore Forest were aware of as the point beyond which their familiarity with the terrain ceased to be reliable. They could describe it, but not locate it precisely on any map. It was the point where the trails they knew became trails they did not know, where the creak sounds came from directions that did not correspond to any creek they were aware of, where the sense of knowing where you were dissolved into the sense of simply being in the forest with no particular relationship to any specific location within it. Most experienced trappers had a point like this in their mental map of the forest. They did not go beyond it. Not because they had been told not to, but because the accumulated instinct of many years in difficult terrain had taught them that there were places where the forest's relationship to the person inside it changed in a way that did not favor the person. They recognized the feeling, and they respected it, and they stayed on the side of their own experience. Samuel Reach had been at that interior threshold more than once. He had described it, in conversation with other trappers over the years, as a sensation of the terrain becoming active, not in a threatening way exactly, but in the way that an attended space feels different from an unattended one. He had said, "It's like the forest knows you're there, not in the way the animals know. They know and they react. They move or they freeze. This is different. It's like the forest itself has turned its attention toward you. Like you've become the thing being observed, rather than the thing observing." He had always turned back at that threshold. In November of 1883, he led 27 men past it. The local community closest to Whitmore Forest, a small settlement called Reed's Crossing, whose residents included several of the men who went in with the expedition, had a body of understanding about the forest that predated the trapping era. It was not written down. It was passed between generations in the way that practical knowledge about dangerous terrain is passed, through accumulated warning and example, rather than through formal instruction. The oldest resident of Reed's Crossing in 1883 was a woman named Dolly Fitch, who was 81 years old and who had been born in the region before Missouri was a state. She had outlived 3 husbands and most of her children, and she sat on her porch in the autumn of 1883 and watched the preparations for the expedition with an expression that her granddaughter, who was 12 years old at the time, and who told this story 60 years later to a researcher from the Missouri Historical Society, described as the expression of a woman watching people prepare to do something she could not prevent and did not intend to endorse. The granddaughter said, "She said nothing to the men who were going. She did not try to stop them. She sat on the porch and watched them assemble, and when the last of them had gone into the forest, she went inside, and she told me to come with her. She sat at the kitchen table, and she was quiet for a while, and then she said, 'Some of them will come out.' She said it the way you say something you know, rather than something you believe, with the flatness of a fact that has already happened, as far as your knowledge of it goes, even though the event itself is still in the future." The granddaughter said, "I asked her how she knew. She said, 'Because some always come out.' She said, 'That's the arrangement.'" The granddaughter said, "I didn't know what she meant. I asked her what arrangement. She said, 'The forest takes what it needs. It has always taken what it needs, but it always sends some back.' She said, 'It's not generosity.' She said, 'It needs someone to tell what happened. It always needs someone to tell.' She went inside and didn't speak about it again until the 9 men walked out 11 days later. When they came out, Dolly Fitch's granddaughter ran to tell her. She found the old woman already at the kitchen window, looking south toward the Whitmore field where the 9 men were standing. The granddaughter said, "She looked at them for a long time. Then she said, 9, that's generous," and she turned away from the window. She died 4 months later, in the ordinary way of very old women in hard winters. She she left no written account of anything she knew about Whitmore Forest. Her understanding of the arrangement, whatever its source, proved accurate. The 9 men had come out. They had been sent back, and they had been sent back with something to tell. What they told, when they finally spoke, on the morning of November 20th, was recorded by the county sheriff in the notes that were sealed for 41 years. But before those notes, before the formal accounting of what the 9 survivors described, there is the testimony of Thomas Whitmore's father, who was the first person to speak to them at length and who told the sheriff something that the sheriff included in his preliminary report before the sealing. He said, "They all told the same story. Not approximately the same story. The same story. I spoke to each of them separately, and I spoke to them together, and the words were the same words, in the same order, with the same pauses in the same places. I have never heard 9 people describe anything the same way. People don't tell things the same way. They notice different things and they remember different things, and they put different words on what they saw. These 9 men told it as if they had been given the same document and had each memorized it, which is not possible, which is not how people work, but that is what happened." He said, "The story they told was not a story I am going to tell to anyone casually. It is the kind of story that requires you to decide, before you tell it, whether you are willing to put it in another person's mind." He said, "I have decided not to be." The sheriff asked me, and I told the sheriff, and I will leave it to the sheriff to decide what to put in writing. The sheriff put it in writing. He sealed it. 9 men told the same story in the same words. 18 men were never found. And the forest waited, the way it had always waited, for the next time. The Stone County court records were partially opened in 1967, 41 years after their second sealing. The researcher who first examined them was a historian named George Patton, no relation to the general, who was employed by the State Historical Society of Missouri, and who had been working on a broader history of the Ozark Highlands for the better part of a decade. He had come across references to the Whitmore Forest expedition in several county newspaper archives, and had spent 2 years establishing the chain of documentation before he was granted access to the sealed materials. He spent 3 days reading the sheriff's notes. He published one paper about what he found in 1969 in a regional history journal. The paper covered the factual circumstances of the expedition, the assembly of the 27 men, the entry into the forest, the emergence of the 9 survivors, the duration of their silence, with careful precision and complete source citation. It established the historical record of the event in a way that subsequent researchers have found thorough and reliable. What the paper did not include was any account of what the 9 men had told the sheriff. Patton was asked about this omission at a conference in 1971. His response was recorded in the conference proceedings. He said, "The sheriff's notes contain a detailed account of the story the 9 survivors told, and I read that account in its entirety. I chose not to include it in my paper for reasons that I do not intend to describe as scholarly. The scholarly reasons for its omission are that it is uncorroborated testimony from traumatized witnesses, and that its inclusion would require more contextualization than the paper's scope permitted. Those are accurate reasons. They are not the complete reasons." He was asked what the complete reasons were. He said, "The complete reason is that I read the account of what those 9 men described in the Stone County Courthouse in October of 1967, and I have thought about it carefully since, and I have concluded that publishing it in full would not serve the purposes of historical understanding in proportion to the effect it would have on the people who read it. He said, "I am aware that this is an unusual position for a historian. I am also aware that it is the correct one in this case." He retired from the Historical Society in 1974. His research files, including his notes from the Stone County examination, were donated to the state archives after his death in 1989. They remained uncatalogued until 2003, when an archivist processing a backlog found them, and, recognizing their significance from the conference proceedings reference, read them and cataloged them with a notation recommending restricted access. The restriction was applied. The files remain restricted. What is known about the content of the sheriff's notes comes from three sources. The first is the 1967 patent paper, which describes the circumstances without describing the content. The second is a letter Patton wrote to a colleague in 1972, which has since been found in the colleague's papers, and which contains more detail than the paper, but less than what Patton had access to. He was, the letter suggests, deliberately withholding even in private correspondence. The third source is the surviving testimony of one of the 9 men themselves, given not to the sheriff in 1883 but privately, to a family member, in the last year of his life. The man was Harlon Vess. He was the first of the 9 to speak on the morning of November 20th. He lived until 1921, 38 years after the expedition, and he spent those 38 years in Stone County, continuing to trap, continuing to work the outer ranges of Whitmore Forest, never again crossing the interior threshold. His daughter, a woman named Martha Vess Greer, gave an interview in 1948 to a writer for a regional magazine who was doing a piece on the history of Stone County. The interview was not published. The writer apparently decided, after conducting it, that the material was not appropriate for the magazine's audience. The transcript of the interview survived in the writer's personal papers and was donated to the Missouri Historical Society in the 1990s. In the interview, Martha Greer described a conversation she had had with her father in 1920, the year before his death, when he was 73 years old and, as she put it, had decided that some things should be said before he could no longer say them. She said, "My father was not a man who talked about Whitmore Forest. In all the years I was growing up, in all the time I knew him, he never said a word about what happened in there. He trapped the edges. He lived normally, or as normally as a man can live when he is carrying something large and silent inside him. He never talked about it. He never talked about the 18 who didn't come out. He never talked about the 6 days of silence or what came after them." She said, "But in 1920 he came to my house and he sat at my kitchen table and he told me. He said he had decided it should exist somewhere outside of himself before he died, and that he trusted me to hold it carefully and to use my judgment about what to do with it." She said, "What he told me, I will tell you in part. In full, I won't tell anyone, because my father's judgment about what to do with it was my judgment too, and my judgment is that the full version of it is not something that does good things to the people who carry it." She said, "The part I'll tell you is this. The 9 of them came out because the forest let them come out, not because they escaped, not because they were lucky, because something in that forest made a decision, and the decision was that 9 of them would leave and the rest would not." She said, "My father said the decision was communicated to them, not in words, not in anything they heard or saw exactly. It was communicated the way that very large and very old things communicate, by putting the information directly into you, without the intermediate step of language." He said it felt like knowing something you had always known and had simply not had access to before. She said, the information included Y9 and not more or fewer. He said the number was precise because the purpose was precise. 9 men was the number required to make the telling credible. 1 man telling a story can be dismissed. 2 can be dismissed. 9 men telling the same story in the same words at the same time. That is not dismissible in the same way. He said, it needed enough of us that the story would have to be dealt with. Not believed, necessarily. Just dealt with, registered, put in a record somewhere. She said, and then she paused for a long time, and the writer asked what the story was, what the 9 men had been sent out to tell. She said, I'll tell you what my father said the forest wanted known. He said the forest is not empty. He said it has never been empty. He said the things that live in it. And here she paused again and said, he did not use the word things. He used a word I have never heard anywhere else, before or since. A word that I believe he did not know before November of 1883. And that was put into him along with everything else. A word in no language I recognize. I will not try to reproduce it because I cannot reproduce it accurately, and an inaccurate reproduction of it seems to me to be worse than none. She said, he said the 18 who did not come out are not dead. He said this very clearly and very directly, and he said it was the most important part of what he had been given to say. They are not dead. They are in the forest. He said, the forest does not kill what it takes. It keeps it. He said, keeping is what it does. It has been doing it since before there was a word for the forest, or a name for the county, or a people living in the region who would have given it either. She said, my father was a practical man. He was not a man who used language carelessly, or who said things he did not believe to be true. He said the 18 men who did not walk out of Whitmore Forest in November of 1883 are in the forest. He said they were alive in whatever sense that word applies to something that has been kept by a forest for decades. He said he did not know whether alive was the right word. He said he thought the right word was the same word he could not reproduce, the one that had been put into him in the forest, the one that had no equivalent in any language he knew. She said, he told me that he had gone back to the edge of the forest many times in the years since 1883. Not inside, never inside, just to the edge. He said that on certain mornings, in certain weather, when the conditions were right in some way he could not specify, he could hear something from the interior of the forest that he recognized. He said, I hear them. I can't say I hear their voices because what I hear is not voices in any sense I can point to. But I hear something that I recognize as them. He said, they know I'm there. They know all 9 of us are still out here. He said, that's part of the arrangement too. The ones inside know the ones outside are still on the other side of the tree line. And the ones outside know the ones inside are still on the other side. She said, he died in 1921, quietly, in his bed, in the manner of an old man who has finished what he came to do. She said, the last thing he said, the morning he died, was addressed to no one in the room. He was looking at the ceiling or through the ceiling at something none of us could see. And he said, quietly, in the manner of a man completing a long conversation, he said, I told them. She said, I don't know who he was talking to. I have thought about it since, and I have 2 possibilities. Either he was talking to the people in the forest, telling them that he had done what he was sent out to do, that the story existed now outside himself, Or he was talking to us, to me and the others in the room. And the them was the forest itself, or whatever is in it. And he was telling us that he had kept faith with the arrangement all the way to the end. She said, I think it might have been both. She said, I think that was the point. The 18 men who did not come out of Whitmore Forest in November of 1883 were not forgotten by their families or their community. The months and years that followed the expedition produced several attempts to find them, attempts that were conducted with varying degrees of organization and official sanction, and that produced results that were, uniformly, nothing. The first organized search was conducted in December of 1883, 6 weeks after the 9 survivors emerged. It was organized by the county sheriff and consisted of 12 men, chosen specifically from among people who had not been part of the November expedition, on the theory that fresh eyes and fresh terrain knowledge would produce different results. The search party entered Whitmore Forest from the southern edge, which was the same entry point used by the original expedition. They returned after 2 days. They found no trace of the missing 18. They found no camps, no equipment, no sign of passage through the terrain. They found tracks, not the unusual tracks that had prompted the original expedition, but ordinary human tracks, old, that they believed corresponded to the entry of the original party. These tracks led into the forest, and then, at a point that several members of the search party independently described as approximately where the terrain became noticeably different, denser, darker, the kind of change that you register without being able to point to a specific cause. The tracks stopped, not faded, not diverged, stopped. One of the searchers, a man named Cecil Prout, who had been trapping Stone County for 15 years, described this stopping point in a statement given to the sheriff. He said, "The tracks end at a line. I don't know how else to put it. There is a point where the tracks are, and a point where they are not. And the transition between those 2 points is not gradual. A man walking through mud or leaf litter leaves a continuous record of his passage. These tracks end the way a road ends, at a point where someone decided they ended." He said, "I went past the point. I went 20 yards past it, into the terrain where there were no tracks. I did not find any tracks. I did not find any sign of passage. I turned around and came back." He said, "I have been in these woods for 15 years, and I am not a man who frightens easily, and I want to be clear that I am not describing what I found in terms of fear. I am describing it in terms of the practical assessment of a man who has been trained by 15 years of woods work to pay attention to what the terrain tells him. The terrain at that point told me that what was on the other side of it was not something I was equipped to address. I turned around. I believe I made the correct decision." The second search was in the spring of 1884, organized by the families of the missing men. It was larger, 22 people, including several men with military experience who had served in the Civil War and who brought a systematic approach to the search that the December effort had lacked. They entered from 3 different points on the forest's perimeter simultaneously, intending to work inward and establish what the terrain looked like from multiple approaches. All 3 groups stopped at the same interior point, identified independently, and described it in terms consistent with what Prout had described in December. The line where the tracks ended, the transition that was not gradual, the quality of the terrain on the other side that communicated to everyone who encountered it that passing through it was not something they were going to do. One member of the spring search party, a man with military experience named Thomas Ryland, wrote an account of his experience at the threshold for a Springfield newspaper. The newspaper published it in May of 1884. The account is remarkable for its tone. Not alarmed, not supernatural in its framing, but genuinely analytical. The account of a man trying to describe an empirical experience in empirical terms and finding the empirical terms insufficient. He wrote, "I have encountered obstacles before. In the war, I encountered obstacles that were dangerous and that required judgment about whether to proceed. This was not that kind of obstacle. A dangerous obstacle presents itself as a challenge. What I encountered at the interior boundary of Whitmore Forest presented itself as a fact. Not a challenge, not a barrier, not a warning. A fact. The fact was that the space on the other side of this point was not a space I was going to enter. It was not communicated to me as a prohibition. It was communicated as a certainty, in the manner of the certainty you have about your own physical limits. I cannot lift a house. I did not know I could not enter that part of the forest. By the time I reached the boundary, I knew it." He wrote, "I turned back. All of my group turned back independently, and at approximately the same point, and we had not discussed this response or agreed upon it in advance. We simply each reached a point and each turned back, and when we compared notes at the forest edge, we had each reached the same point." He wrote, "I do not know what is on the other side of that boundary. I know that I believe the 18 missing men are on the other side of it, because there is nowhere else they could be. The exterior searches have been thorough and found no trace of them. I know that I was unable to go to the other side of it. I know that the inability was not fear, because I know what fear feels like, and this was categorically different. Fear involves a calculation about risk. What I experienced involved no calculation. The not entering was a given, the way certain physical facts are given." He wrote, "I will not be returning to Whitmore Forest. This is not a decision I have made. It is a fact I have recognized." The newspaper published the account. It produced a significant volume of correspondence from readers across the region. Some of it was dismissive. Some of it was curious. Several letters came from people who described similar experiences in various parts of the Ozarks, places where the terrain communicated a boundary that the body recognized before the mind did. None of these accounts produced any official action. A third search was attempted in 1891, organized by a coalition of the families who still had missing members and who had not accepted the informal closure that the community had moved toward over the intervening years. This search was the most extensive. 31 men, including a professional tracker brought in from Arkansas. It produced the same result as the previous two: a boundary in the interior of the forest that none of the searchers crossed. The professional tracker, a man who had worked in difficult terrain across 3 states, spent 2 hours at the boundary before returning to the search party. He told the organizers that he would refund his fee. He said he was not able to earn it and that he was not able to explain why he was not able to earn it in any terms that his professional experience had equipped him for. After 1891, no organized search for the 18 missing men was conducted. The families did not formally give up. They did not have funerals, because funerals require bodies, or a certainty of death that no one had established. The missing men remained in the official record, missing, carried in the county records as unresolved disappearances, a classification that remained unchanged until 1920, when the county undertook a review of long-standing open cases and reclassified the 18 as presumed dead without further documentation. The reclassification was contested by two surviving family members. Their contest was noted in the county record and did not change the outcome. What the searches collectively established, or rather, what they collectively failed to establish but collectively confirmed, was this. The 18 men who entered Whitmore Forest in November of 1883 were not in the accessible parts of the forest. They were not dead in any recoverable sense. They had gone past a boundary that the forest maintained, and that no subsequent searcher had been able to cross. And on the other side of that boundary, they remained. In what condition? With what awareness? With what relationship to the 38 years that passed while Harlon Vess trapped the forest's outer edges and listened, on certain mornings in certain weather, for something he recognized coming from the interior? These questions were not answerable from the outside. They may have been answered from the inside. No one who went in to find out came back to say. Whitmore Forest, as a local designation, is still used in Stone County, Missouri. It does not appear on any official map under that name. The terrain it describes is covered by various official designations relating to the Mark Twain National Forest and other public land classifications. But among people who have lived in that part of the Ozarks for multiple generations, the name persists. What the name refers to has changed over the years in its administrative context, but not in its essential character. The timber is different now. The old growth that characterized the forest's interior in 1883 has been substantially reduced by the logging operations that moved through the Ozarks in the early 20th century. The forest that exists today is younger than the forest that 27 men entered in November of 1883. But the interior, the part that the searchers consistently identified as the point beyond which they could not pass, was not logged. This is a fact that appears in the records of the logging companies that worked the region in the 1900s and 1910s, and it is documented without explanation. The logging surveys note the boundary in terms that are practical rather than metaphysical. The terrain beyond a certain point was not assessed for timber yield. The access was noted as difficult. The decision was made to work the accessible areas and leave the interior. None of the loggers' notes suggest anything unusual about the reason for stopping where they stopped. They stopped because the terrain on the other side of a certain point was not terrain they were going to work. The notes read as ordinary commercial decisions. The old growth at the center of Whitmore Forest, whatever remains of it, was not cut. A botanist from the University of Missouri, who studied the region in the 1950s, noted, in a paper on Ozark old-growth timber, that the central area of what local residents called Whitmore Forest contained tree specimens of unusual age and size, significantly older than the surrounding second-growth timber, and older, in some cases, than the oldest specimens she had documented elsewhere in the Ozarks. She estimated certain trees in that area at 400 years or more. She described the interior as having a quality of ecological stability that was anomalous given the surrounding landscape history. She also noted, in a section of her paper, that the journal's editor had apparently asked her to include because of its relevance to local history, that she had been unable to complete her survey of the interior. She wrote, "Access to the central area of the forest was not possible, for reasons I was not able to identify precisely. The terrain did not present any specific obstacle. My equipment was functioning. My guides were experienced. At a certain point in our approach to the central area, the three of us independently ceased moving forward. I am a scientist, and I document what I observe. What I observed was that I stopped. My guides stopped. We had not discussed stopping. We were stopped in the manner of people who have reached a conclusion, except that none of us had reached a conclusion. We had simply stopped. We stood at that point for several minutes. Then we turned around. The decision to turn around was as collective and as undiscussed as the decision to stop. I note this as an observed fact. I do not have an explanation for it that satisfies my training. She published the paper. She included that section. The journal published it with a brief editorial note, acknowledging that the passage was unusual and that the journal's policy was to publish observed data regardless of whether it fit established frameworks. She did not return to Whitmore Forest. The 1883 expedition is documented in the Stone County Historical Record in the way that traumatic community events are documented. Thoroughly in the immediate aftermath, then less thoroughly as the immediate shock fades, then finally as local history rather than current event. It appears in county histories. It is mentioned in regional histories of the Ozarks. It is the subject of several articles in various history and folklore journals, including Patton's 1969 paper. It is also in the oral tradition of the communities nearest to the forest, a living fact rather than a historical one. Not a legend. Legends have a quality of distance, a patinch of time that marks them as things from another era. What the people who live near Whitmore Forest carry about the 1883 expedition has no patina. It is present knowledge, not past knowledge. The difference between these two qualities is the difference between knowing that something happened and knowing that it is still happening. An oral historian who collected accounts from Stone County residents in the 1980s found this quality consistent across multiple generations and multiple family lines. She wrote in her notes, "People here do not speak of the Whitmore expedition as an event that occurred in 1883. They speak of it as an event that is occurring. The 18 men are not past tense. The forest is not past tense. Whatever relationship exists between the inside and the outside of that boundary, whatever Harlon Vess heard on certain mornings at the tree line, is not past tense." She wrote, "Several residents describe the sense that the forest is aware of the community around it in a continuous way. Not periodically, not under special conditions, but continuously. One elderly man told me, 'It has always known we were here. From before we were here, probably. We're the new arrivals,' he said. 'It lets us do what we do out here, as long as we respect what it does in there.' He said, 'The arrangement has held for 100 years.' He said, 'I see no reason to disturb it.' She asked him whether the 18 men were still in the forest. He said yes. She asked whether he was certain. He said, 'Some things you're certain of, without knowing how you're certain. This is one of them.' She asked, 'How do you know?' He said, 'Because nothing that goes into that forest comes out dead. It keeps things. It has been keeping things for longer than we have names for.' He said, 'The 18 men went in November of 1883. They are in there. Whatever they are in there, they are in there.' She asked, 'Do you think they know?' He said, 'I think they know more than we do. I think that's probably the point.' 27 men entered Whitmore Forest on November 3rd, 1883. 9 walked out 11 days later, standing in a line at the tree line, facing east in the manner of people who have been positioned there by something that knew exactly where the east was, and exactly how many were required, and exactly what they needed to say. They stood in the field, and they waited for someone to find them, the way something placed with care waits to be found. They said, all 9 of them, in the same words, in the same order, the thing they had been sent out to say. The sheriff wrote it down. He sealed it. 41 years later, Someone read it and sealed it again. 20 years after that, a researcher read parts of it and decided not to publish the parts that mattered. And somewhere in Whitmore Forest, past the boundary that no search party has crossed and no logger has logged, and no botanist has surveyed and no person who has reached it has moved through, past the boundary that the body recognizes as a fact before the mind has time to evaluate it. Somewhere past that boundary, in the old-growth timber that is 400 years old and possibly older, and that has been old for longer than the county around it has existed, 18 men, in whatever sense that word still applies, still in there, knowing, on certain mornings in certain weather, that someone is standing at the tree line on the other side, knowing that the 9 who came out told the story, knowing that the story is still being told. This is the story. You have now been told it. Whatever that means, whatever the forest intended when it decided that 9 was the right number and that the telling should continue past the 9, out through the years and the sealed records and the retired historians and the oral accounts of people who live next to the tree line and know, without being able to say exactly how they know, that the arrangement holds. Whatever it means that you have now heard this, the forest knows. It has always known. It is still in there, and it is still listening to find out what you do with what you have been told.